Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 28, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your host as we explore all things sewing. It's the first week of April. Spring is sort of popping up here in Montana, although it's been slow going. When the rest of the country is starting to see daffodils and tulips, we're just happy to see green grass for the first time in many, many months. I do have a greenhouse, and right now I'm busy planting, both for what we're going to grow in our own garden and for a plant sale that I'm the chairman of that happens in the middle of May. Because here in Montana, we usually don't plant until Memorial Day weekend. That's typically the garden planting weekend. If you ask some of the nurseries around here, they'll say don't plant until the snow is gone from the mountains. So that's another way to determine when it's the proper time to put things out in the garden. And this is not a gardening podcast, but gardening is taking up, or at least getting seeds started is taking up a lot of my time right now. So sewing, once again, has been put on the back burner. I've worked on a few small projects here and there. This week, I'm hoping to get a little bit of time to make some class samples for some new classes that I have proposed that I'll be teaching this summer. But until things settle down a bit, I'm not going to be doing as much sewing as I get to do over the winter. I mentioned that I had signed up to be a member of Backstitch, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes. Backstitch is a web-based app that's very similar to Ravelry, if you're familiar with Ravelry as a knitter or a crocheter. Backstitch is aimed at sewists. I signed up to be a beta tester, and it only took about a week before my account was approved. So I signed in, and I actually did sign up for a paid subscription. There is a free version of the app, but if you want all of the premium features, it is about $50 a year if you sign up yearly. And I thought it was worth it. I want to support these developers. I want to see what they're able to do. And I'm liking what I see so far. There are database features. There are discussion group features. The app has a lot of potential, and as I get a little bit further into it in the coming weeks, I'll be sure to be letting all of you know what I'm finding out. Last Friday, I taught a class on knit fabric at our local quilt store. I had 5 students, and I think I had more fun in that class than the students had. It was a great group. I had 2 women with sewing machines and 3 women with sergers. And they were all fearless. One of the ladies who brought a serger, she had a Brother 1034. She wasn't very familiar with it, and she ran into a few speed bumps, but she persevered, and by the end of the class, she was very familiar with that serger. The ladies who brought their sewing machines, both of which happened to be Bernina's, they were also very fearless. They were trying out every stretch stitch and overcast stitch in their machines and having a lot of fun trying out those stitches on all the different fabrics. I had made up 5-inch by 5-inch squares of a lot of my leftover knit fabrics from projects that I've done. And that's what I took to class and handed out. So the students were able to learn about the structure of knit fabric, how it's comprised of knit stitches and purl stitches, and everything is just a combination of those 2 stitches. We talked about fiber content. So we talked about cotton knit fabrics and rayon knit fabrics. We talked about double knit fabrics. We talked about pontes. We talked about French terries. I showed them, they got to try everything. I probably had 25 different fabrics for them to try out. I love those kinds of classes because it's so gratifying to me. One of the ladies who brought a sewing machine had been in my Natalie Cowell top class a few weeks ago, and I asked her if she had been wearing her top that she made in class. She made one out of a black rayon sweatshirt fleece, and she said she's barely taken it off because it's so comfortable. So that really makes me happy when students can come to class and create something and go home and wear it, and she's really happy with it. This week, I'm teaching a class on thread, and that's going to be the subject of today's podcast. The owner of that particular quilt store has done an amazing job of putting together a class roster that is so full that there is almost a class happening every single day at that store. And when I submit class proposals, sometimes the dates that I want to hold a class aren't available just because the schedule is so full. She also invested in an addition to her building to hold classes, and that classroom area is phenomenal. It is one of my favorite places to teach. There's room in there for probably 30 to 35 students if everybody gets cozy. They have open sew there on Thursdays, and I've popped in there when the room has been completely packed. We were talking when I was there on Friday teaching the class about knits, about the fact that a lot of students like to sign up for classes where they come out with a project. Those seem to be the most popular classes, but both of us feel pretty strongly that there needs to be a good mix of skill building classes. So she said she calls hers workshops, and I think I'm going to adopt that. I was calling them skill building, but I think even skill building isn't quite the right term. What we want to do is educate students and make sure that they are savvy consumers, that they know, especially in this economic climate, how to spend their money wisely and what is going to be the best value for their dollar. So that's why I especially feel it's important to have classes that talk about things like the structure of knit fabric, what knit fabrics are best for what patterns, what kind of thread do you need, what kind of needles are best. That's the emphasis that I'm trying to put on at least half of my classes. Some of my classes are still going to be project classes where students come in and they make something. The rest of them are going to be what I'm calling workshops, and they're meant to be educational. If you've been listening to my podcast for any length of time, you'll probably know that I was a professional knitting designer for a number of years. I'm also a hand spinner. I learned to spin in 1990. We were living in southern York County, Pennsylvania at the time, and we were surrounded by sheep farms. And I had said to my mother-in-law how much fun it would be to learn how to spin and make my own yarn. So for Christmas one year, she got me spinning lessons, and she and I actually took spinning lessons together at a local farm, and I became friends with the owner of the farm, and I did some sheep sitting for her when she was on vacation. And one of the rams that she used, his name was Tiger. He was a beautiful, kind of a blackish gray Lincoln ram. And he sired lots and lots of beautiful babies, and he lived to be a ripe old age and passed away at the pasture of another friend of ours. And I was able to get his hide, and it is tanned and on the floor of our bedroom. So every morning when I get out of bed, I put my bare feet on Tiger's fleece, and I remember how I learned to spin at that farm. I used to tell people in my knitting classes that I became a much better knitter when I started to spin, because I began to understand yarn construction and how it affected knitted stitches. So the same thing is true. There are a lot of similarities between yarn and sewing thread, and I was able to start with a basic understanding of how threads are constructed, but in the course of doing the research for this class, I learned so much. So that's why I decided to talk about it on today's podcast. I've already got all the research material put together for the class, and I want to share it with all of my listeners. This is not meant to be exhaustive. In addition, I'm probably not going to hit the industrial thread side of things as much as threads that are intended to be used on domestic machines. I do have a passing familiarity with industrial thread just because I have an industrial sewing machine, but I'm going to concentrate today on thread for domestic machines because that's what I'm going to be teaching in tomorrow's class. For my class this week, Wonderful Threads, which is based in Canada, put together thread kits for each student consisting of 6 different kinds of thread from their thread line. They have 36 threads in their thread line, and we chose 6 that would represent what students were most likely to run into in domestic sewing machine work or serging or embroidery work. And Wonderfil isn't a sponsor, but I am a Wonderfil educator. So I just want to say thank you to them because they've been very supportive of this, and I'm hoping to teach this thread class at the store in Missoula, which is also a Wonderfil retailer. I want to start with thread structure, and as I said, I'm not going to go into exhaustive detail. I will cover 3 different kinds of threads here. The first one is spun thread, and that's the one that probably most of us would be most familiar with because just as the name implies, it's spun like yarn would be spun, typically from short fibers. When you spin wool, you can use fibers up to, maybe 6 to 8 inches. If you're spinning cotton, the fibers are going to be much shorter. They may be anything from lint, literal tiny short fibers, up to Egyptian long staple cotton, which might be 1 inch long. And obviously, the longer the fibers, the more integrity the thread has. So if you've got a particularly linty cotton thread that leaves lint all over your machine, it's probably because it was spun from very short fibers. In addition to cotton, threads can be spun from polyester fibers. They can be spun from rayon fibers. There are lots and lots of different fibers, but what they all have in common is that they are spun into a single strand of thread, and then those single strands of thread are typically plied together or spun back together upon themselves. Here's where I'm going to get a little bit technical. When you're hand spinning, depending on which way the wheel is turning, you're either creating an S spun, S as in Sam, an S spun yarn, or a Z spun yarn. And if you were to look at the letters S and Z next to each other, you would see that those center axes go in different directions. In the letter S, that center axis leans to the left, and in the letter Z, that center axis leans to the right. And so you can take a strand of yarn and you can untwist it, and you will be able to see that it is twisted in one direction or the other. Typically, when you're hand spinning yarns, you hand spin in one direction and you ply in the other direction. So if I spin my single threads in the S direction, I'm going to ply them together in the Z direction. Spinning fibers into thread or yarn puts twist energy into the thread, which is why if you take a single strand of thread and you twist it and then let it relax, it will twist back upon itself. It's actually plying itself. And that's because plying removes a little bit of twist energy from each individual strand and creates what's called a balanced yarn or a balanced thread. And that is the kind of thread that will hang straight and not twist or torque. Obviously, I could talk about spinning for days, and I might do another podcast about spinning, but let's talk about why you might want to choose a spun thread over a different kind of thread construction. And that would be because spun threads are softer and fuzzier, and they tend to have a matte finish. They have good elasticity, and that makes them a good choice if you're sewing knit fabric because you want a thread that's got some bounce to it. They're usually less expensive than filament or core spun threads, which we're going to talk about in a moment. The one drawback is that they're not as strong, so they can be prone to breakage, and they also require more tension adjustments on your machine. So those are things to keep in mind. The second kind of thread construction that I want to talk about is filament thread. These are typically nylon or polyester, and this is where the thread is extruded by a machine in one continuous length. So it's not made up of tiny little fibers. The benefits of using a filament thread are that you get a shinier finish. These are best for high-speed machine sewing and heavy-duty applications. So think embroidery or home dec or upholstery. They're more expensive than spun thread, but they are less prone to breakage and they've got great tensile strength. So if you were to try to break one of these by pulling it between your hands, you'd probably have a lot of difficulty. They also provide a more consistent tension while sewing because they're just more even than a spun thread would be. Even the nicest spun thread is going to have some irregularities in it. One of my favorite threads to use in my Juki industrial machine is called Optipop, and I get it from Wowak. It is a polyester filament thread. So you can use a single filament, that's called a monofilament. As the name implies, monofilament, one filament. But Optipop is applied thread. And again, when you use applied thread, it could be either 2 plies or 3 plies, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but filament threads are very strong, and so that's why that's typically what it gets used in industrial machines. The last type of thread construction that I want to talk about is a core spun thread. And a core spun thread is what would happen if a spun thread and a filament thread had a baby. So a core spun thread is a continuous filament with a spun thread wrapped around it. And a few weeks ago, I went to visit my friend Tara, who lives a few miles away from me. She and her husband have a sheep farm, and they also recently bought a woolen mill. They bought the machinery for a woolen mill and installed it in a building on their property, and they are starting to spin wool from their sheep, and eventually they'll be taking in wool from other people. But one of the yarns that they've been making on their spinning equipment is a core spun yarn, and it is a central yarn that is wrapped with some of the fibers from their sheep, and they have a particular kind of sheep called a Leicester long wool. And as the name implies, long wool, it has fleece that have long locks on it, so 6, 7, 8 inches. And those locks of wool get wrapped around the central core and create a very thick yarn. And my friend Tara's husband, who is also a weaver, is weaving them into bath rugs. That's a really unique use for that kind of a yarn. He's making a textured yarn, but a core spun thread doesn't have to be textured. The inner thread is usually a polyester filament. The outer spun thread can be cotton or polyester. A core spun thread combines the best features of spun threads and filament threads, but they're more expensive. And I was doing, in the course of my research, looking at a denim website, so a company that makes denim clothing. And one of the comments on that website was that typically they'll use a spun thread in the serger for serging the edges of the fabric. So if you look at the inside of a pair of jeans, for example, there's usually a 5-thread stitch. So 3 threads are on the edge of the fabric, and then there's a chain stitch that's made up of the remaining 2 threads. And they said that they use spun threads there in that part of the construction because those stitches aren't going to be visible, and typically they don't need to be quite as perfect. Where they use a core spun thread is in the top stitching, because that obviously is going to be on the outside of the garment, and They want it to be perfect. They don't want to have any skipped or broken stitches. So they are willing to spend a little bit more on the coarse spun thread to use it in places where it's going to be visible. So I thought that was an interesting explanation of the difference in using different kinds of threads in different parts of a garment. Next, I'd like to talk about thread construction in terms of the number of strands in the thread. So one of the things that I discovered when I was spinning for knitting was that a 2-ply yarn has kind of an elliptical cross section. The 2 strands lie next to each other and they just sort of wrap around each other. When you add that 3rd strand for a 3-ply yarn, the cross section of the yarn becomes much rounder, and I think you get better stitch definition. So I was doing a lot of designing with cables and textured stitches, and I could see a distinct difference. If I knitted a cable with a singles yarn, with a single strand of yarn, not plied, the effect was very subtle. If I used a 2-ply, it was a little bit clearer, but when I went to a 3-ply yarn, the stitch definition really popped. So that's a tip for you knitters out there. If you're knitting cables or textured stitches, look for a 3-ply yarn because you're going to get better stitch definition than if you use a 2-ply yarn. When it comes to sewing thread, I don't think it matters quite as much in terms of the number of plies and your stitch definition. I could be wrong about that, but I think at that micro level, you're not seeing the same difference that you would see in a knitted sweater. There is one place where that becomes an issue, and I'll get into that a little bit later when I start talking about thread weights. 2-ply versus 3-ply becomes an important consideration there. The final characteristic to consider in the structure of thread is the actual shape of the thread. With a round thread, let's say a cotton thread, light bounces off that thread in oblique directions. Let's put it that way. And because it bounces off that thread in oblique directions, what you see is a matte appearance to the thread. Rayon thread, by contrast, is an irregular shape. It's not round. And so light bounces off of rayon thread in lots and lots of different directions, which is why sometimes when you look at rayon, it has a matte finish to it, and sometimes it looks like it has a really shiny finish. It's kind of holographic almost in that regard. There's also a thread shape called trilobal. So if you see something that says trilobal polyester, that means that the shape of the thread is actually, if you were to cut that thread in cross section, it would be a triangle. It has 3 sides. And interestingly, I did not know this until I started researching it. Silk is a naturally trilobal fiber. When light hits a trilobal fiber, it bounces directly back at our eyes. And that's why a trilobal fiber is going to look very shiny. Now I want to talk about fiber content, and I am going to say what I always used to tell my knitting students, which is that there is no one fiber that is best. You will run into people in the knitting world who will say, I only knit with natural fibers. And those people, not all of them, but some of them tend to look down on people who knit with acrylic yarns. And people who knit with acrylic yarns probably have extremely good reasons for why they chose those yarns. It's not always because they're ignorant and they haven't seen the light about natural fibers. Sometimes people can't tolerate natural fibers. Sometimes those yarns are out of their price range. So one fiber isn't better than another, but there are always situations where one fiber might be a better choice than another, and it's important to approach your thread selection based on those factors. I know of one person who always used to say, cotton is rotten, and refused to use cotton yarns in her sewing. That is her choice. She has good reasons for why she chose not to use cotton yarn. If you're a quilter, though, there will be situations where a cotton yarn is going to be the right choice. She said cotton is rotten. That was kind of her motto because cotton yarns, being a natural fiber, do tend to degrade. And if you've ever picked up a spool of thread that might be vintage, so even 30, 40, 50 years old, and tried to use it, you might find that it is deteriorated to the point where it's breaking. So yes, cotton won't last forever, but cotton might be the appropriate thread choice for that particular application. And I apologize. I know I keep saying yarn instead of thread, but I'm talking about thread here, not yarn. Think of it like a toolbox. You wouldn't have just a hammer in your toolbox and use a hammer for everything. It wouldn't work for one thing, and it would be a bad choice of tool for a lot of situations. If you needed a screwdriver, a hammer probably wouldn't help you very much. So it's good to have a variety of tools and a variety of choices in your toolbox so that you can use the one that is most appropriate for the situation. So that's what I'm going to say about fiber content. You can find threads made of cotton, wool, polyester, rayon. I've even sewn with Kevlar thread because I've done a little repair work for the turnout gear for our fire department. So threads come in lots of different fibers, and it helps to know what the application is and what would be the best fiber for that application. If you're serging, you're almost always going to be using a polyester thread because a cotton thread just won't be strong enough, unless you're using it in the loopers for some kind of decorative application. Now we get to the messy part of the discussion. We're going to talk about thread measurement systems. There is no standardization across the industry, and this lack of standardization causes a lot of confusion. We used to run into the same thing in the knitting world. There was a period of time where when you said worsted weight yarn, people knew what you were talking about. In the late 90s, I think, or early 2000s, a lot of the manufacturers tried to go to a numbering system, which sort of worked. I wasn't real fond of it. So thread suffers from the same problem. If you are a quilter, you are probably most used to choosing a thread based on the weight system. The weight system has some problems. At one point, there were 3 main designations. A 30 thread was thin, a 40 thread was sewing weight, and a 50 thread was heavy. And those numbers apparently were borrowed from the Japanese Gunze count system, Gunze, which was developed by Japanese thread factories. What they did was use the first number to indicate the weight, followed by a slash, and then usually the number 2 or the number 3. So a 50/2 thread would be a thread comprised of 2 plies. Remember I said I was going to talk about plies? This is where I'm going to talk about them. A 50/3 thread would be a thread comprised of 3 plies. The 50/3 thread is going to be a little bit thicker because it has 3 plies instead of 2. I will put a link to the Superior Threads website in the show notes because that is, I think, one of the best places to get technical information about thread. But what happened with that system, the 30, 40, 50, 50/2, 50/3, what happened with that system is that apparently U.S. importers started calling all 50 thread 50 weight, whether it had 2 plies or 3 plies. And I actually, even before I started researching this, I ran into this because I quilt on my Bernina Q20, and I went to a quilting store, not the ones that I usually shop at, but I went to a quilting store, and I needed a particular color of gray thread. And I picked up what I thought was a 50 weight thread because the spool said 50 on it. It said 50/3, and I brought it home and I started quilting with it on my Q20. And normally I quilt with 2 ply threads because the manufacturer whose thread I typically use on that machine makes a 2-ply thread. This was a 3-ply thread, and I thought to myself, this isn't a 50 weight thread. This actually feels more like a 40 weight thread. And it was because it had 3 plies. And so that made it a little bit heavier than the 50 weight 2-ply thread that I had been using. North American quilters seem to be the only people in the world who use the weight designation for thread. I guess if you go outside the United States, nobody knows what you're talking about when you ask for a 30 weight or a 40 weight thread. And maybe some of my listeners in other countries could verify that for me. I don't know if that's true or not, but I will tell you that quilters in the United States love weight designations for their threads. The other issue with the weight designation is that it's an inverse system, similar to wire gauge systems. The higher the number, the thinner the thread. Just like a 26 gauge wire is going to be thinner than a 16 gauge wire, an 80 weight thread is going to be thinner than a 40 weight thread. And anything that goes in an inverse direction is going to be a little bit harder to wrap your head around than a direct correlation. So the advice I have seen from 2 different thread manufacturers, companies that manufacture quilting and sewing thread, I've seen this advice from both companies. The advice is to not put too much stock in that weight designation, but to rely more on your eyes and your fingers. Your fingers are really good at tactile distinctions, and they are able to tell the difference in thickness. Even a really tiny difference, you'd be surprised at how well your fingers are able to tell those kinds of differences in threads. Just for reference, a 12 weight thread is the thickest thread that you can use in a sewing machine. You can use an 8 weight thread in a serger, in the loopers, so something like pearl cotton, but a 12 weight thread is going to be the heaviest thread that you can use in a sewing machine. I will tell you right now that I am not a machine embroiderer. I love to hand embroider, but I haven't done much machine embroidery. But apparently, machine embroiderers like to use the denier system of measurement. A denier is 1 gram per 9,000 meters of fiber, and it's based on the natural reference of a single strand of silk being approximately 1 denier. A 9,000 meter fiber or strand of silk weighs about 1 gram. Denier is a direct measurement system, so the higher the denier number, the thicker the thread. You'll also see the denier system applied to cloth. So when I buy Cordura fabric from Seattle Fabrics, I buy it based on the denier number, so 500 denier or 1,000 denier. That designates how thick that Cordura is. The system that I am becoming the most fond of, and probably because I'm doing more and more industrial sewing on my Juki 1541, but I really like the Tex system. The Tex system is apparently relatively new and based on the metric system. Yay! I wish we had gone to the metric system when I was in elementary school. The Tex system is intended to provide some consistency in thread classification, but it's been slow going in its adoption because quilters love the weight system and embroiderers love the denier system, but hopefully it will catch on eventually. So the Tex standard uses 1,000 meters of thread per gram as the starting point. So if 1,000 meters of thread weighs 1 gram, it's Tex 1. If 1,000 meters of thread weighs 25 grams, it's Tex 25. Tex is a direct numbering system. The higher the number, the thicker the thread. Typically, when I'm sewing stuff on my Juki Industrial, I'll use a Tex 35 thread, maybe for construction. I might use a Tex 69 for top stitching. The Wawak Optipop thread that I mentioned earlier comes in Tex 35, Tex 45, and Tex 75. The last topic I want to cover in thread is about put up. And put up refers to how thread is wound on a spool or a cone. And there are two different kinds of put up. You can have a stacked thread, stacked put up. And this is typically if you were to go to Joann Fabrics and get some Coats & Clark thread off the rack, it would be a stacked put up where each round of thread is stacked on the previous round of thread. Stacked spools are meant to sit on your sewing machine such that the thread comes off in a horizontal direction and feeds into the machine. If you have ever put a stacked spool on a thread stand and tried to have the thread come off in a vertical direction, you will be familiar with what happens. It either gets hung up in that little groove on the end of the spool, or it gets tangled up, or it snaps back, or something happens that makes it not feed smoothly. A spool cap will help avoid these problems, and it's usually a good idea to use one anyway. Be sure to look at your spool of thread to determine if it's wound horizontally or stacked. Not all threads that come on spools are stack wound. Some of them are cross wound, and cross wound spools and cones are what I'm going to talk about next. Threads that are cross wound form an X pattern on the spool or the cone, and these are intended to feed vertically. They need to be used with a stand or a lift. Virtually every thread that I use on my industrial machine comes wound on cones, and I have a thread lift at the back of my machine where I put the spools or the cones of thread, and they come off those cones vertically before coming down into the machine. There are occasions when you will want to use a stack wound spool on a machine like a serger that's intended to have thread coming off of cones. And in those situations, what I do is put a horizontal spool pin on the vertical spool pin so that I can place my stack wound spool on the horizontal spool pin and have it feed that way. And you can get these spool pins at most sewing stores or quilt stores. I know our quilt store carries them. They're made by a couple of different manufacturers. The ones that I really love are very simple. They come in a 2-pack for about $10, and they are a horizontal bar, but the end of the bar it's hard to describe. It's got an opening that gets progressively smaller with some ridges inside, so it will fit a variety of different kinds of spool pins. So if you have a spool pin that's a thicker diameter, it'll fit that one. If you have a spool pin that's a thinner diameter, it will fit that one. It's a very clever design, and I have multiples near my sergers and my cover stitch machine, but I keep them near all of my sewing machines, and they've made a huge difference in what kinds of threads I'm able to use. Just a couple other miscellaneous things that I forgot to mention while I was talking about thread. You might see the terms mercerized or gassed or double gassed. So mercerized is typically applied to cotton threads, and that's just a coating to make it smoother. Even if a thread doesn't say mercerized, it's probably mercerized because I guess that's standard application now for most cotton threads. A gassed or double gassed thread is a thread that has been passed through a flame to burn off the excess lint. So if it's been gassed, that means it's been passed through that flame once to burn off the lint. If it's been double gassed, it's been passed through twice. I think this is where I'm going to end this week's episode. No doubt I have forgotten something, so feel free to leave a comment on the podcast episode page. If you go to www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com, you'll find each of the episodes, and there's a list of show notes there, as well as a place to leave comments or questions. If you want to contact me directly, email me at janet@janetzabo.com. I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. Also, if you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, and I'm looking for people who have an interesting or unique story to tell, so I don't want to just interview somebody who wants to talk about their sewing hobby. I'd like it to have some interesting angle. Maybe you have a small business, or you've written a book, or some other feature that you want to talk about. I do have a guest form now on the website. So if you go to thestraightstitchpodcast.com, there's a menu on the left-hand side. It's a drop-down menu. You have to click on the little hamburger icon. Drop down, there's a link to the guest form. Please fill out the guest form. That helps me because it all goes into a single database at the back end of my website, and that helps me to keep things straight. I will tell you that I've gotten quite a few submissions in the last couple of weeks, so I may close the guest form down at some point because I won't have time to do all of these interviews and all of these episodes in the next month or two, but I will release them as I get them done, and I've got some very interesting ones coming up, so I'm excited about that. As always, reviews and ratings on iTunes and Spotify and other podcatchers are greatly appreciated. That helps other people find the podcast. So if you want to go and leave a review, please do so. And until next time, I hope you have a good week and that you get to go sew something. And I hope I get to go sew something.